What is happening, everyone? Welcome on into the Check Your Brain podcast, the free edition for this week. Thank you for listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, as I'm sharing the screen right here. I'm also on YouTube and Rumble and X and everything. And if you enjoy my content even more than this free weekly episode, go check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Tony Mazur, TonyMazur. By the way, hi, I'm Tony. I didn't even introduce myself. What kind of broadcasting professional am I? But yes, that's my name, Tony Mazur, and that is my Patreon, patreon.com/Tony Mazur. Go check me out if you want about 3 or 4 episodes per week. You can subscribe for free, but the most of my content is paywalled. It's just $3 a month. It is literal pennies per episode. So go check it out if you want. If not, enjoy this free episode. So I've been doing a lot of solo shows, but it's time I brought a guest on and somebody who I've known for goodness, almost 20 years. And a lot of people
Almost
can,
20
yeah,
years.
a lot of people can say that, oh, this person helped get my foot in the door to this business or that. This man literally is the key that opened the door to my career in broadcasting, whatever you want to call that in 2026 now. But nearly 20 years ago, this man sent an email to WKNR, it's a sports station, to Jason Gibbs and said, "Hey, I'm looking for if I know a couple of people. If you are looking for interns, I know this guy named Tony Mazur. He's interested, and why don't you go check him out?" And I went in for an interview. They're like, "Yeah, you're hired. When can you start?" And it's been downhill ever since, John. I'm just kidding. But
I
joining
hope
me
that wasn't the high point, Tony.
joining me here is John Kerezy. He's making a second appearance on the podcast, and he's from Cuyahoga Community College, associate or was it associate or assistant professor? I know it starts with an A.
Associate professor. That'll be my last title there, Tony.
There you go, of journalism, mass communications, and yeah, the man who helped get me my first internship, and I've been in contact with him for nearly 2 decades. And so I had you on about 3 years ago, and we were talking about all things going on, the ever-changing media landscape. And since then, it's changed a lot more. And I got a couple of topics. We ran by it off the air and talked a little bit, but with you being someone who has been in this business for a long time, of being a professor, seeing the academic side of journalism, of broadcasting, of mass communications, and seeing how it's changed from the days of the old traditional media, of the newspaper, the radio, and the television, to the days of the internet, where now this has become the mainstream. Does it just boggle your mind how much has changed in just a brief amount of time?
Yes, it does. I was thinking back, Tony, getting ready for us to talk today, back to 2006, I think when we met, 2007,
Correct.
that time. You know, most teens maybe had a cell phone. They did not have a smartphone. And I remember my early years of teaching at Tri-C. If I took a break and I was in a room with computers, every student would come up to me and ask, Professor Kersey, could you turn on the computers? Because they'd want to get onto the internet during their break, because they didn't have the instant access that we all have today through our various and sundry devices. Having said that, I still think that the digital revolution that's going to continue to change us forevermore is rooted on the fact that in the United States and in most democracies, people have 24/7 access to a wealth of information, some of it free, some of it paid. But regardless of that, it's freed us from what used to be the old rule of appointment type media. Hey, if I wanted to watch Star Trek when I was a kid growing up, and yeah, I'm that old, the original series, I had the third season, I would have to watch it Friday at 10 o'clock because that was the only time you could. So I think the first thing that's changed is the freedom of the schedule. The second thing that has changed is the burgeoning of all the channels, which just continues to explode. When Walter Cronkite said that's the way it is for the last time in March of, I think it was 81, there was something like 16 million, maybe 17 million people watching those nightly newscasts. Average was about 13 or 14 million. Now they're down to like 3.5 million a day.
If that,
Almost
at
as
this
much,
point.
yeah, or maybe not even that. That's in the official ratings. Brett Baer on Special Report on Fox is drawn in between 2.5 and 3 million a night, just for an example. And the dirty secret, like you said, is that all of these media are actually in some state of decline in some way, shape, or form. It's sitting at the national level as we see more and more layoffs. It's hitting at national um, internet only type outlets like the Daily Wire and other places. And I think it's going to eventually get to the local level. We're going to see declines at the local level as well when local advertisers become less willing to spend their dollars on local television. And that's the big worry, I think, in newsrooms and ownership of these places all over the country. You know, there's a station in Cleveland, and I'll name it WJW, that if you pull it out of the various portfolios, it alone is worth more than $1 billion. And the reason it's so valuable is because it's so good at garnering advertising from local companies, local car dealers, local shops, and so on and so forth. If those people see continual declining numbers in local news and they start pulling their advertising dollars, you're going to see a landscape transformation in local TV, like we've seen in national print over the last decade, 2 decades, and as we've seen in national networks and cable, as we've seen more recently. So this transformation is going to continue. I also think that when we saw it here in Cleveland recently, what, about 5, 6 months ago, um, Salem let go a morning guy, a guy named Bob France, very conservative talk guy, and put somebody else on in his place. And I'm not going to mention the somebody else, but rather than just go away, Bob went the route you're going. You know, he went on Rumble. He's got a daily show. He's got Patreon. He's got sponsors. He's doing everything he can to keep his voice and keep his thing out there. And again, because of the internet and because of all the changes that are going on, that's more prevalent than it's ever been. And I only think that pattern is going to accelerate. Of course, the biggest one we know is Tucker Carlson, but there are other examples of that as well.
It's funny because we're actually recording this on the day, I believe the day after, or I think it's tonight the last episode of Stephen Colbert, the
I
last
believe it
episode.
is.
So it's interesting because I remember 11 years ago when David Letterman stepped down, and it felt like the late night comedy, whatever you want to call that, had run its course. It used the format that Johnny Carson had pioneered for decades, and it was familiar. It was you have opening monologue, then you have maybe a silly sketch or talk to the band, first guest, second guest, and either a comedian or a musical guest to end the show. And then that's it. Then it's the Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder after that. But then things had changed and it got way too familiar to the point where the demographic who watched Johnny Carson in the 70s and the 80s and into 1992, they started aging and then they had children, and the kids were like, I don't want to watch this. And it reminded me of the baby boomer generation and their adverse reaction to Bob Hope. While Bob
Yep.
Hope to their parents was a hero. This man was going to USO shows. He was funny. He's a comedian. He can sing if he wanted to, all over the place. Host, the best host. I know everyone talks about Billy Crystal, but best host of the Oscars. And yet, by the boomer generation, they were like, yeah, that's what my parents watch. I don't like Bob Hope. He's too rah rah, whatever, Nixon or, so tastes change as time goes on. So now that I'm looking at all these tributes to Stephen Colbert, I go, is anybody offering him a tribute that's either not in politics or mainstream media or someone who's not 70 years old? Because no one my age at 38 watches late night TV, and certainly nobody younger than me watches it. And it just goes to show that this is accelerating. This is accelerating very quick, where Letterman had a good send off, but even by that point, the format had been played out. Even more so now. This is just things are changing, and I don't know where else we go from here. I mean, we're at the point where Byron Allen is taking over for Stephen Colbert as an infomercial. It's not a show. It's a 1 hour infomercial every night.
Excuse me, Byron who?
But yes, exactly. I hear comics
Yeah,
unleashed. I've never felt
yeah,
more leashed, as Norm
yeah.
Macdonald said.
You know, you hit a great point there, Tony. If you don't mind, I want to do the previous idea and then go right back to what you
Go for
said.
it.
Every generation rebels against the standards and the mores of the generation ahead of it. Um, you don't have to be a big Star Trek fan to enjoy about the first 5, 6 minutes of the opening of the Star Trek 2009, the reboot, where very young James Kirk is driving at a high rate of speed on his stolen dad's Corvette and he's about to go over this cliff. playing rock and roll music at a super loud volume. It's a great way of just saying rebellion, rebellion, rebellion. And we've seen this as long as I've been alive. As long as I've been alive, my generation hated Elvis Presley. We loved the Beatles and we loved all the hard rock that was coming in after that. For years and years, I'd ask a quiz question in my intro to mass comm class. What was the first song popular song that had the word heavy metal in it? It was kind of funny to watch students kind of grasp for an answer for that. But
What
what you
was it?
hit on,
I actually don't know.
Steppenwolf, Born to Be Wild.
That's right.
I like
Wow.
Smoking
Interesting.
Lightning.
Heavy metal
Heavy
thunder. Yes.
metal thunder. Yeah, okay, you got it.
Okay, got it.
Back to your question though, and back to the point. All right. I really believe that comedy died out, began to die out when Johnny Carson said goodnight, and then really by the time that Letterman's tenure was done. And Leno was fine. I mean, I could go on and talk about other things. What I'm referring to is the format. The younger generation had really turned off on it. So seeking an audience, seeking advertisers, seeking a way to maintain relevance, people like Colbert went the political side. I could call it the dark side, but I don't want to get into any Star Wars Force analogies here. But what happened is, as they become increasingly political, they isolated one segment of the population at the expense of the other side of the population. So if you're over here on the left, hey, I'm really, really happy with Colbert. And if you're over here on the right, you've turned them off. All right. When you do that, you basically are beginning to pander instead of just trying to search for what I call a mainstream audience. And we see this more and more in media, where the media will tilt one way or tilt the other way because they think that's going to get them more audience, get them more advertisers, get them more ratings, get more whatever. And in general, when it happens, it doesn't happen that way. It's just the opposite. It tends to happen. They get less and less of an audience. So, Colbert pissing off Trump. I mean, does Trump really care? I don't know. Because really, in my mind, he's been irrelevant for some time. But that's just me. It's not my personal opinion. It's not the professional opinion of Cuyahoga Community College or my other colleagues in the professorial ranks. But having said that, I think, if you look at the ratings numbers for a long time now, a lot of people have been tuning Colbert out. So it's like, okay, we're having maybe the funeral a year or two after the patient died.
Yeah, and it's what I find interesting going forward is I look at not only network television, which is now, when I noticed that was starting to wane was when must-see TV stopped being must-see and it just turned into television. And now you're having nightly game shows, you're putting a ball game on, you're putting reruns of shows from 30 years ago on just to fill time.
Yeah.
Not to mention cable TV, which is
Yeah.
all just what is it now? Because
Great.
MTV is done, Comedy Central is essentially done. It's now just Seinfeld over and over again. MTV died years ago with
Tony,
18
great
hours of
points.
ridiculousness.
Yeah. Why would Amazon pay money to the NBA to run basketball playoff games?
Yeah.
Right? Game 7, I saw on Amazon Prime. Why? It's simple, because they have customers conditioned to pay, I don't know what it is, 150, 175, $200 a month for that subscription. And they're looking for anything that can justify and keep that stream of revenue going. That's their almighty dollar right there. So, hey, if I toss in some sports and I pay money for sports, and again, baseball, football, it's all available on Amazon Prime right now. Well, if you'd ask me back 2002, when I first got my Amazon account, what is Amazon? I would have said, oh, it's a great place to buy books.
Yeah.
And look what's happened. Amazon is a prime example of the disruptor economy of the internet, because there were 101 startups like Amazon back then. Many of them died, disappeared. People lost a lot of money in that tech startup. But those that survived, right? Amazon, Google, I could go on. They're the biggest cheeses on the block right now. And the reason why is that they were smart enough to realize that what they were selling wasn't just bricks or mortar. What they were selling wasn't a free email address. What they were selling was the ability to tap into people's wallets.
Yeah.
And
It's a
that's
good
and
point.
that's in my mind, and that in my mind is what's really important. And that's what I teach my students in my basic intro class. I joke, Professor Kerezy's timeless truth #1 is, and I wish I could reach in my wallet. I don't have it. It's all about the Benjamins. It's the dollars that make this media industry go round. It's the dollars that made the newspaper industry go round. And when all that declined because of the rise of the internet, and they didn't see it, they were stupid. They were like the dinosaurs. And that's why we see so many dying off. I like to point out, 2001, 2002, there were upwards of 400 members of what was the Newspaper Guild One, Local One, which was the Cleveland Guild. Many of them were with the Plain Dealer, but there were some other ones as well. That union no longer exists. It got basically put out by the ownership of the Plain Dealer, and the number of people who get work now as journalists in this city is probably maybe 20% of what it was 20 years ago. And it's because of all these changes and revolutions that have been happening, some of which you talk about on your podcast.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting, you were talking about sports and the fact that my parents didn't have Peacock, and they're like, I guess we can't watch a basketball game right now,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yet, and it reminded me of 20 years ago when the trade, which people, it's kind of a funny thing about Al Michaels was traded for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, if you know that story, with Disney and NBC,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but he went over, but Al Michaels obviously went over to NBC, and ESPN ended up getting the rights to Monday Night Football. And people kind of forget about this, but that was a huge deal at the time because even in 2006, a lot of people said, "I don't have cable. I don't need cable. I need my 3, 5, and 8, as we always called it here in Cleveland, plus a
Right.
PBS and one of the UHF or VHF stations." But you didn't really need that. I have a newspaper. I have everything I need right now. And but if you want to watch Monday Night Football, you're going to have to get ESPN. You're going to have to get a cable package. And then what happened 3 years later was the end of analog,
That's
and
right.
you were forced. So it wasn't so much that people's consumer habits changed. It was they were forced, or else you're going to watch nothing. But now we're
Yeah.
in this age of kind of an a la carte programming that we are seeing, and not only a la carte programming, a la carte media consumption, where I don't have to read the local newspaper anymore. I can go to a website that has my whether political beliefs, social beliefs, whatever, and read blogs instead of here's the breaking news going on in the community. So we've now created this, it's not even a cottage industry anymore. It's an entire industry of whatever I want, I can easily find it, as opposed to this shared culture that we kind of had for all these years, and it has been truly broken up in the last 15,
Yeah.
20 years.
And 24/7
Yes.
and a blend of paid and free. I don't know the answer to this question, Tony. I don't know if you know it either, but I'll just throw it out because you'll see where my mind is going with it. How many media outlets cover the Cleveland Browns in Northeast Ohio?
Too many.
Yeah, yeah. Forget about the, I call it the mainstream. Forget about the newspapers. Forget about the TV stations, like you said, 3, 5, 8, 19, whatever. You can toss the newer internet in, is like 13 others if you want. How many bloggers are out there? How many people are dedicated to one aspect? Hey, I only write about the offensive line. I only write about the wide receivers, right? There are so many out there. I can't keep track of them all. I see women popping up that aren't official Browns reporters, but they're doing stand-ups in front of cameras and talking about aspects, and they're outside the camp in Berea. So it makes it seem like they're an official Browns reporter for somebody, when actually they're just a step behind you in terms of what they're trying to do. They don't even have a Patreon site yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and
Yeah.
also influencers, because we're now in
Right.
the 21st century and
Oh,
now the 2020s, where because when I found this out is when I started covering games for alternative media outlets, and it took me a while to wonder why they were doing that. Why would a team that's one of the four major pro leagues allow basically a blogger who's 21 years old to cover a team? And I realized because you can manipulate them into the access of getting a credential and getting a chance to talk to some of the players, maybe getting an exclusive somewhere possibly. But if you're too negative and too critical, they'll just easily yank your credential away. So there's
yeah.
always that carrot that's there, and you got to continue obeying. And that's why I wondered, why would they allow me into the locker room, for God's sake? And I realized, oh, it's because you can easily control those people.
And you also gain access to an audience that you might not be able to obtain otherwise. I don't coach high school speech and debate anymore. I gave it up about 5 or 6 years ago. But one of my final students, she had like 2.5 or 3 million followers at one point on TikTok. She's like 14 years old. That type of reach in terms of an influencer has a dollar value that's attached to it. And it's just an undeniable fact. And we see that in everywhere. It's in entertainment, it's in sports, it's in politics, it's in news, because news is a business. And it's in all aspects of what I call the internet-based information economy.
So you mentioned earlier because we had talked about this off the air about the recent layoffs that they're admitting at the Daily Wire. And I recall around that time when I was covering teams on a blog where this rise in alternative media had popped up. And now there is an alternative media to alternative media because the alternative media from 10, 15, 20 years ago is now become the mainstream media in many ways. And mainstream media became old media. So now everything is really changing. And now, because I remember when the Daily Wire, the Daily Caller, Breitbart, and I'm using more conservative sites just because for the sake of the argument here, that when they began, they were essentially opinion blogs and occasionally would have a podcast. And then they turn into empires to the point where they're getting White House credentials. Then the bubble burst. And the bubble burst, I think some of it was political, usually when kind of like Rush Limbaugh in the 90s, where he can be the thorn in the side of the Clinton administration. But by the time his ideology takes over, you're not as relevant anymore. I think that plays into it. But I think also it's just overplaying your hand and understanding where you're at and seeing what people will spend their money on as far as alternative media nowadays. And I'm curious to hear your side of this, of somebody who, for all these years has seen traditional media change, but now the lid is in the scab has really just been torn off, especially in the last few years with influencers and with this rise in streaming and how people are obtaining this type of information.
And the reason why, in my mind, goes back to the silos that people like to live in. We like to hear information with. And because of that, you're seeing this proliferation of outlets, and I call it the splintering or ever greater segmentation of that. The Daily Wire didn't surprise me much at all, Tony. What doesn't really surprise me is that the people from the Daily Wire will go form two or three or four other internet entities. And they're going to go out there in some way, shape, or form. And if there's one person from the Daily Wire that you like, you're going to be able to find them somewhere. When you began to go down this path, I looked up Glenn Greenwald,
Yes.
because in my mind, here's a guy that would kind of has lived what you just described. He began his career in journalism by writing for a Salon in 2007. And he left there and he spent a little bit of time with The Guardian, but he formed The Intercept, predecessor to the Daily Wire, which is very successful. He got bought out and eventually they let him go. And then he went out on his own and he's now making money on Substack and other things as well. The interesting thing about Greenwald, though, is as he's progressed in his, I'll call it his internet news life, he has moved further and further and further to the right. And the reason why is I think people on the right tend to be willing to pay money to outlets because they want to hear the side that they agree with rather than the people on the left. The people on the left think that they can control the mainstream media, NBC, ABC, CBS. And that's why you see these numbers, in my mind, continuously going down, along with CNN and used to be MSNBC, MS Now. I call it MS, soon to be never. You know, um, the simple fact is that uh, the left keeps pushing way over to the left. The right pushes to the right, but maybe not as much or as fast. And as this happens, new outlets spring up all the time that support or basically parrot back what they think the audience will want to listen to and or pay for. So if we had like a chart, like a media bias chart from 10 years ago, it would have been like this wide. And now it's going to be like this, simply
That's the
because there's
Overton
so
window.
many more outlets out there. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well,
Because there's so
and
much
also
more out there.
And also with the Overton window, because you go back 10 years, you say something a little bit controversial, you're thrown out. There's, especially you see this, and not to get political or anything, but there is a lot more gatekeeping that goes on the political right than there is the left. It seems like in many ways the inmates can run the asylum, and the Pelosi's and the Schumers will be like, well, whatever, I guess this is where the party's going now. Whereas on the right, there you're seeing it this past week with Thomas Massey and Ed Galrine down in Kentucky, that there is a lot of political gatekeeping as who's a Nazi, who's a neocon, and it's all this mudslinging and name calling. But because of that, you are seeing a rise in that alternative media on one side. So it's like if you're not just going to Rush Limbaugh anymore or Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly anymore. You're going to, like you said, Glenn Greenwald, who most conservatives 10 years ago wouldn't have even thought about agreeing with Glenn Greenwald,
That's
yet they're
right. Yeah.
continuing to agree with him a little bit more than, say, a Mark Levin. And it's
Yeah.
it's very interesting how things get fractured, things get saturated, and then that saturation sometimes becomes oversaturation. So I'm
Yeah.
it's very interesting going forward as to what it's going to be by the 2030s. I mean, let's be honest here. We're closer to 2030 than 2020 at this point. And how and it kind of leads me to my next question about AI, that how if you have somebody, let's say, who it doesn't even we don't even have to talk politics. It could be just a cultural reporter, but you know what they would say normally. Why not just run it through an AI filter? That an AI bot can just do somebody's show. Why not have if the Red Hot Chili Peppers sing songs about California all the time, well, why not just do AI songs that are familiar to the audience about the Chili Peppers in California as opposed to making new music? So will I guess my question with AI as far as consumption, will the public go for that? Because I'm already seeing a backlash at our local paper that's been doing these weird AI Ghibli type of videos, and people are like, ugh, that's just there's like a visceral reaction to it. But like, what do you see going forward? Are the people really truly embracing AI, or is there going to be a backlash?
Oh boy. Tony, you asked about four questions there.
I sure did. I apologize for that.
It's
That's
okay. It's okay.
maybe
Let's
if I maybe
let's
if I sat in a couple more classes, I would have been able to be a little bit more concise. Keep it short and sweet.
let's let's try to break some of this apart, okay? First off, I'll go kind of in reverse order. Um, AI is the genie that's out of the bottle. It's going to take over so much in so many different aspects of everyday life. We can't stop it. Um, and I'll just give you some examples, right? I did a trial on Grammarly, and I'm not paying a penny for it, but it'll still pop in on one of my computers and try to basically correct everything that I write. I didn't ask for it. It's just doing it. And I think more and more people are doing that. My wife complained because she can't get to anything on like a search engine anymore without AI trying to direct where she's going. So it seems to be taking over a lot of our aspects of that.
It's out.
Now,
It's out. We're outsourcing our thinking to AI rapidly.
and for me, that's scary. And for you, given the title of your podcast, that should be really scary.
That's right. Check my
Now,
AI.
now,
That's going to be called in a couple of years.
yeah, yeah. Now let's go back to that question about AI in journalism. Um, I think it's good and bad. I think what's good about it is the ability to more quickly ascertain a big set of facts or a big set of documents and kind of get a quick summary and a quick analysis of what's going on. I'm going to do a shout out to somebody that you may or may not know because you probably don't know him because he's kind of like an anonymous person back there at Cleveland.com, the plain dealer. But his name is Rich Exner. And Rich had a title at one point called the Computer Assisted Reporter. And what his role was to use the Census Bureau, other official reports and documents, and ferret down and dig deep and look at inferences and trends, and then present them in a way that could statistically augment or back a story that another reporter was working on. All right. Whereas those other reporters got laid off or left or went to other jobs, Rich kind of took more of a front page seat. And now he's more than just a computer assisted reporter. He's basically using AI plus research to basically supersize the types of stories that he's working on. Um, Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer has kind of been on Main Street, kind of embracing AI and trying to have their reporters use AI more. They're teaching them how to do that. And I think that's a good thing. I was on the original AI task force at Tri-C, and I know this is kind of scary, right? But that task force convened in 2023, just a few years ago. And in that task force, we basically came up with what I call three paths. The areas and the parts academically where AI would be permitted and or encouraged, and that would be areas like computer sciences, if you're trying to get an IT degree, something like that. The other side would be areas where AI would be prohibited or extremely discouraged, and that would be like English writing, English 1010, English 1020, some of your basic classes like that. And then in the middle would be, excuse me, that was my phone. And in the middle would be places where it would be used in some areas and not used in others. So, for example, you could use AI to help outline, to help develop three key points in an argument or something like that in a Com 1010 class. Um, that's kind of gone out the window because it's on everybody's devices now. It's really hard. I hardly see a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old student nowadays who's not using AI. It just is just the way it is. It's just the reality. So what does this mean for journalists? It means journalists are going to be expected to be able to use Claude or some other, AI device, Gemini, Grok, whatever, to basically come up with things better, faster. But the downside in my mind, and the critical thing is I still want to see the sourcing. I want to see the facts. I want to see the actual information that's behind what a story says. I don't want to take some computer algorithm's word for it because we know that they can be wrong. All right, they can also reach the wrong inferences depending on who's involved in the large language model programming. By the way, a couple of those companies approached me about going to work for them back 3, 4 years ago, and I just turned them down flat. I didn't want to be involved in what's coming up. Back to what you said, right? I have this discussion with my Com 1010 public speaking students and tell them you can't use AI to write your speeches. And one of them was just insistent with me where I should be able to, I should be able to. I said, suppose you turn in a speech and I can't tell if it's you or if it's some avatar that is speaking in your stead. Does that count? And all of a sudden she got the point. She realized, okay, this is where this is going. You know, videos that are like I said, coming up with artificial characters. We all hear that voice that's narrating something, and we all know it's an artificial voice. I don't know where the public's going to land on here, but I'll tell you one thing I know for sure, Tony. The public will always land on the side of a genuine, caring, understanding, heart-to-heart, person-to-person relationships. People who deal with that and deal in those terms are always going to have a place in the marketplace, in my opinion.
I look at when it comes to whether it's automation, whether it's just new technology, usually it takes a few years and for something to be affordable and available to them for it to be normalized. For example, Teslas and self-driving cars. Right now, they're way too expensive for the normal person. So we're still at paying $5 at the gas pump right now. Um, the television. There was a time where, back in, 70s and the 80s, the television may not have been all that large, but it was an entertainment center. So you could put all your anything else that's around there. It was a part of the furniture. Then the big screen TVs came out, and then you're like, "Ooh, I went to somebody's house and had a big screen TV. How much did it cost? $10,000? No way, I would never do that." Then the flat screen TVs, and you're like, wow, look, I could pick this up by myself instead of having 5 people pick up this thing. How much does this cost? 3,000. It's too expensive. Now I can go down the street to Best Buy, get a flat screen TV for $200, and everybody has a flat screen TV in their house right now because they're
Flat screen,
available.
big size TV for two,
Correct.
$300. Yeah. And
Exactly.
and if you wait till Black Friday, you can get it at Walmart for $100.
Exactly. And that's where, when it comes to AI, that I'm noticing normal people who are not in media, not in school, just people who work a normal blue collar 9 to 5 job playing around with AI because it's free and it's available
Yep.
to them. And when you
Yeah.
give people this opportunity, just like Google, just like Facebook, they'll run wild with it. And I think that's what's for, like you mentioned about 2023. I recall having these conversations. I think I talked about it with you 3 years ago on the show that it's inevitable. We all knew it was going to happen. And the classic video of Will Smith eating spaghetti. For folks who don't know what that reference is, that was an early video for AI that they would put together where it's Will Smith having a plate of spaghetti. It's not real. It's not actually Will Smith eating spaghetti, but somebody put it together and it wasn't right. It was there the mouth was a little too large. There were six fingers. The spaghetti was a little pixelated. Now it's 2026 and every year they keep adding to this to the point where it's by I would say in 2 years completely unrecognizable and you would think Will Smith is eating a plate of spaghetti right now. And
Yeah.
it's hard to put that back in the tube. Will the people embrace the AI and AI consumption? I kind of hate to use a new term, black pill, but I kind of think they will. And if it's available, I don't think the idea of a story and like, oh, well, people want to hear a song written from somebody who had this horrible experience and they wrote about it and they have this great art and they expressed it through their lyrics in this song and how somber it is. I don't think I think people, right, especially younger people, don't really care where music comes from. I've talked about it a lot in my podcast. I think right now we're going to be in this area of absolutely sterile mass media that it's I think the only way that you can fight it if you are really this mad about it is to just turn your phone off and go for a hike.
Yeah. You mentioned two things, and I want to toss onto that the Will Smith spaghetti. If people on your podcast haven't done it, they should look up moon disaster. And they're going to see a video of Richard Nixon giving a speech that says the Apollo 11 astronauts have died on the moon, and we sympathy to the family, and so on and so forth. AI, complete deep fake video. It was done about 3 or 4 years ago by MIT. And the funny thing about this particular fake speech is that the speech itself was actually written. They found this in the archives. It was written just in case there was an actual disaster and they didn't come back. And they just interspersed some actual footage of another speech that Nixon made, and basically that's it. You're finding it.
There it
You
is.
just found it, Tony. Yeah, there it is. So this is nothing new. There's another one you could look at: Brent Spiner and Mark Zuckerberg. And then that's explaining how it was done. Yeah. Somebody took testimony that Zuckerberg gave in Congress, and they put the actor who played Lieutenant Data on Star Trek: The Next Generation's face on it. So it looks like Spiner, and the words coming out sound like Spiner, but it was Zuckerberg that was actually saying this stuff. This is all going to be in the realm of a good iMac or a decent and laptop computer at some point on down the road. And when that happens, I think people are going to accept it. There's Mr. Smith and the spaghetti. Yeah. Because they're not going to be able to tell the difference. What scares me, and it's kind of funny you mentioned black pill, right? I use a different maybe look at it. Um, System of the world pill, because Russia and China, and to a lesser extent Iran, but especially Russia and China, are extremely adept at disinformation campaigns. And what they're doing is they're using social media and they're using AI to try to convince Americans of different things. Let me just say it that way. They're trying, in the case of Russia, what they're trying to do is pit this against us. I've seen research that in 2016 and 2020, we saw the big rise of the Black Lives Matter. If you
Hmm.
went back and you tracked a decent chunk of the very hyperactive social media posters who were very pro Black Lives Matter or very pro police, you wouldn't find them living in Omaha. You wouldn't find them living in Dallas. You wouldn't find
Nope.
them living in Charlotte. You'd find them living in Russia. They were Russian trolls who were being paid to do this. And I think what AI's horror story is that, if the Chinese or the Russians figure out a way to put this on steroids, that they're going to basically try to convince all of us that A is B or green is blue or something like that. And we're going to have even more division in our already pretty divided society. So that's kind of my take on that.
It's a bit of learned helplessness where you have younger people who are raised on the internet, and a lot of us are kind of playing catch up to what younger people are doing right now, as far as streaming and as far as all that goes. But like you said about AI, that you can have somebody, I don't know, go out and start yelling racial slurs, just horrible racial slurs in the street, and you show them, and someone's like, you got to explain yourself. That was AI. That wasn't me. What are you talking about? I would never say that. Are you kidding me? And we're going to get to a point where you don't know what to believe anymore. And it's happening a lot quicker. I think this was something that everybody's had in the back of their mind all the way since the beginning of the internet. Remember, don't believe everything you read on the internet, said Abraham Lincoln. And there is a lot of stuff, and it really is a slippery slope. So now we're at the point where it's almost an acceptance that the blurred line between fantasy and reality is already here. It's just a matter
Yeah.
of, do you, and now it's to the point where, how much do you trust the AI? Because I
Yeah.
can put in
And
Grok. I was going to say, I could put in Grok and say, tell me about Tony Mazur from Cleveland, Ohio. And they would say, yes, Tony Mazur was a broadcaster who was born at Marymount Hospital in Garfield Heights. And I would say, no, actually, Tony Mazur was born at Hillcrest Hospital in Mayfield Heights. Oh, I'm sorry. And then you realize, wait a second here, it's pulling from what sources now. So some sources could be different, coming from different places where it depends on what source you trust. So it could tell you what you think is a gospel because it's AI, but who's controlling the AI? That's what I have a
yeah.
problem with.
Yeah. And there's a second part of this, and I think is extremely important. This is what I call the ethical part of it. If this is journalism, if this is an actual reporter working for a newspaper or a TV station or an internet outlet or whatever, I believe they have an ethical obligation to explain that they're using AI. And maybe even if it's a lengthy story, put a little footnote or something at the bottom that says exactly here's how we used it. So that the person who's reading, if they want to get into the depth of what's going on, they could catch that. I think that's very important because just like you said, there are a lot of mindless people who really aren't going to delve down into the depths. They're just going to look at what's up top and they're going to accept that as gospel. Oh, Tony was born at Marymount, and that's all they're going to see.
Yeah. And that kind of was like that with Wikipedia. And I look back because I don't feel that old, but I'm 20 years out of high school. And I remember a time of actually doing schoolwork in high school, having to show my work, having to cite sources where I found this information. And a lot of it was from a book that I had to
Yeah.
go to the library. I had to use the Dewey Decimal System to try
You
to
had to
figure out
use
what.
card catalog. Oh my goodness.
Goodness gracious. Yeah, exactly. And then when Wikipedia came around, because I feel like I'm one of, not to sound crass or anything, but I really do feel like I'm the last chopper out of Vietnam because the year after I graduated high school, we saw the rise of the iPhone. We saw the rise of Wikipedia and Facebook and a lot of this that was going on in the mid to late 2000s that have changed not only the way we think, but our behavior. And now we're seeing this is, not a topic we'll get into, but I just find it interesting how they said that college enrollment is way down right now. And you say, well, why is that? And you say, well, could it be college is very expensive and people can't afford to send their kids and put them in student loan debt? Or could it be the fact that the iPhone was around in 2007, and the people who would normally be having children born in 2008, meaning they would be 18 years old, well, they decided to opt not to have kids and possibly look at certain websites on their phone and not be interested in trying to find a mate. I don't know. There's probably a social psychology to that, but I think we're going to deal with these experiences that uh, have been put forth and have bred this stuff in this culture for the last 20 years. We're seeing this stuff play out right now. That truly the consequences of our actions from years ago are playing out in front of us right now.
They are absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And all you got to do is find some psychologist to be on your next podcast to verify everything you just said, Tony. You'd be in great shape.
There you go. Yeah. So a couple more things, then we'll wrap it up in a little bit. We'll talk a little bit Jesse Owens here in a second. But one of the last things, just talking about this consumption of media and how people had good jobs in the business of broadcasting, where you can live in a market like Cleveland, Ohio, which is admittedly dwindling now. People are leaving for greener or warmer pastures. But at one time, it used to be one of the bigger cities in the United States and very large media market, Cleveland, Akron, Canton, Medina, everywhere. Um, but but there was a time where you can be a newscaster doing the 6 and 11 o'clock news and make close to $1 million a year.
Yep.
Nowadays, you can't justify that. Certain personalities have since retired or passed away that now their replacements aren't going to make a lot of money. When I worked at a radio station at the sports station here in town 15 years ago, the morning hosts were making $125,000 a year each. When both of them got let go due to various situations, contract ending up or saying something stupid on the radio, they were replaced by people who two of them took one of their salaries. So
Yeah.
take out that $250,000 a year for two hosts. Now it's $125,000 a year for two hosts. And then if those two who are still on the air right now get let go, the replacement is going to make even less than that, and less than that, and less than that. So it's very difficult, I would assume, being in your position of being in media and seeing how people would want to get a job in this business where you basically have to tell them you're not going to make a lot of money. You could probably use something like this as a springboard to something else. The days where you wanted to be a sports center anchor on ESPN is nothing more than a springboard to doing a show on some other network or whatever. It's just something to put on the resume. And then I look at it now, like we said about the Daily Wire and the alternatives to alternative media, where if you want to do a podcast or you want to do a stream and you want to do this, you understand you're not going to make the money that you used to. You might make more money due to super chats or subscriptions or whatever, but you're not going to make that base salary because you're not, it's not you're not working in advertising type of broadcasting anymore. Like you're now doing direct to consumer advertising in a way by using yourself as advertising. So I guess that's a difficult conversation to have in this ever changing media landscape, is telling somebody that if you want to get into this business, you just have to understand you're gonna make poverty wages, maybe forever, unless you decide to leave and do something else like I did.
Yeah, Tony, you're again, you're hitting the nail right on the head. Let me give you some things in statistics that kind of buttress that, but let me also say up front, I'm a living example of this. I'm retiring this year from Cuyahoga Community College as a professor of media and journalism studies. For about the last 15 years, we've had two such professors on my campus. The college made a decision because of declining enrollments in my area that I'm not going to be replaced.
Mm.
And that was a bitter pill to swallow for about 4 or 5 days. And then I had seen the numbers and I said, it's really not a bitter pill to swallow. When I had my first full-time year at Tri-C, which was, I think, '06, '07, we had somewhere around 650 students taking at least one media and journalism studies class.
And I was one
This
of them.
past, yeah, this past year was about
Although I had Roger Rabba as my teacher.
Roger Rabbit. Wow. This past year was about 150. It's gone down that much. Now, everything you've described has contributed to that. But I can also tell you that along that 20-year course, I've had many discussions with students and occasionally with students' parents. And I'm a very transparent, very, honest, ethical person. I could not look them in the eye and say, oh, if you major in journalism, you're going to have a phenomenal career, because that would have been a lie 20 years ago and it'd be a lie today. What I do tell them is that if you have real passion and you have a real desire to do something and you're willing to work hard and perhaps you have to be entrepreneurial at it, you're going to come out okay. You know, so lots of different people in my past have proven that in different ways. Perhaps the one that I enjoy the most is what we're doing right now, the podcast. You're one of several, I'll call them loosely, former students that are doing a pretty good job with, as in podcasting. No, you're not going to get rich on it. No, you're not going to be in the top 5% in the podcast world. But having said that, you're going to enjoy what you're going to do. You're going to sleep well at night. You're not going to have to worry about somebody looking over your shoulder and slapping you on the wrist because you said or did something wrong. And you're going to cover a lot of fascinating, interesting topics. So in my mind, it's just not a bad life. It might not be the life you had idealized 20 years ago, but hey, I didn't know 20 years ago where Tony Mazur getting an internship at ESPN or WKNR was going to go. He has no way of knowing that. It was just, hey, this is what somebody wants. If I can make this happen short term. Right now, I've got a young lady that's going to be doing an internship with a nonprofit in Medina County this summer. It's what she needs at this point in her life to decide what that next step is. And that's probably the biggest thing I think I've seen in college in the last 20 years. You talked about the decline in enrollment, and I'll also talk about the feminization of colleges. I saw a statistic that 62% of this year's college graduates, 62%, that's almost two-thirds, were female. All right. So it's more of a sociological reason. Why are we scaring males away from college? But and again, I don't want to deal with that today, but having said that, I think what's really going on is that people are beginning to realize that there's not a correlation between getting a college degree and getting a great job, not just in journalism, but in many, many different areas. There's only a handful of areas where there's a great correlation between getting that degree and getting a great job. And the reason why is that all these fields are changing. It's not just journalism, it's medicine, it's accounting, it's the legal profession. What is AI going to do to the legal profession, by the way? Just give that a thought for a minute,
It's passing the
But
bar already.
yeah, exactly. And what I'm trying to say is that I think today's college students are scared. They're less resilient than people of your generation, and they're more afraid. It didn't surprise me at all. You probably have heard this clip too of college students at prominent colleges all over the country at commencement this month booing when the commencement speaker mentioned the words artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, you're looking at your replacement, and who wants to do that? It's it'd be like, hey, I'm getting forced out, but hey, for the next couple of weeks, can you train this person who's going to take your job and your salary and your livelihood? And yeah, I think my generation of millennials were it's a strange time because we dealt with a lot of strife in our lives, and not to sound over dramatic or anything, but when you're raised in the 90s and then all of a sudden you're about to get to high school, or I was about to get to high school, and then 9/11 happens, and then now we're in college and there's the financial crisis and there's all these other things that have popped up, and then by the time you feel you're safe in your career, then the COVID lockdown started. And there's a lot of that feeling that I guess the bill of goods that we were sold, that my generation was sold, is we followed a template that had worked for Gen X and worked for baby boomers in many ways.
And
Was
it was used and it was broken for you guys. Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. I
it was
couldn't agree with you more.
it was a rug pull for a lot of us where it
Yep.
was the idea of Gen X went to college, they got their degree. It didn't matter what you got your degree in, just you get it. And I know, as soon as you graduate, you get that diploma, and your phone won't stop buzzing because somebody's going to call because they're like, you're the perfect person for our position. And I've talked about this in I'm sure my listeners on my podcast are sick of hearing about this when I say this, but there was that feeling of you need to do this. You need to go to college. You need to go through this whole ritual that has been normalized in society for about 30 something years by that point of going to college, get your degree. Yeah, you're going to take on some debt, but it's all going to pay off when you get this good job. Then the good job stopped because it was either you do that or you work in fast food. And then all of a sudden it became, what, are you too good to work in fast food? What, are you too good to work at Panda Express? Make that orange chicken. And then, oh, by the way, we're also replacing you with the H-1Bs, different conversation. But I think that the younger generation who's going to college now, the Zoomers, are now aware of this stuff. They're aware of that rug pull. And that's why they would boo AI. That's why they would feel that they're going through this idea of college, but it's different from that college, like a anywhere from an Animal House type of movie to a other National Lampoon direct to DVD movies from back in the day of what the college experience is, because no one knows what that experience is going to be going forward.
Yeah. The thing that I found ironic about that, Tony, is you've heard the expression biting the hand that feeds you. For some of
Oh
these
yeah.
college students, they were booing the hand that was feeding them. They've been using AI to get their assignments done and get through college and get their degree. And now they're realizing, oh, this tool that did A for me now may be dooming me on down the road.
It's amazing. It's truly amazing. That's why when I thinking back to if I were in high school and the rise, if Wikipedia, which we all know is I think it's registered out of Langley for people who really want to know. But uh, that if that were around, I mean, what's the point? Actually, that's my last thing I want to ask you before we get to Jesse Owens was being a teacher and with you retiring and everything, but I also have a lot of friends of mine who've now are have been teaching for 15 years. How do you teach a student who has all the information that they have next to them if they want it? It's right there. You want to learn about whatever the lesson is, you can find it and find all different sources and maybe bias some might be true. How do you teach? It's very strange. I've heard this from people who teach younger kids, and the fact that they are sitting in a classroom and they're having withdrawals, like they're going cold turkey off of cigarettes because they don't have their device, that dopamine rush in front of them. And I'm concerned about because it's you're not teaching. It's like it's how do you teach? How do you force a kid to learn something in a world where all of this is just so readily available to them?
Yeah. You use that verb force. Uh, I'm a big believer in individual choice.
Oh yeah, me too.
I've been that way all my life, and I cannot make a student learn. If a student doesn't want to learn, they're going to face a cliff at some point in their lives. And it might be before they get out of college. It might be on their first job, full-time job, whatever it might be. They're not going to make a living, at Chick-fil-A or Burger King unless they plan on, staying in mommy and daddy's home indefinitely. Um, my big example to talk about what you're discussing are my live Com 1010 classes. They're public speaking classes where they learn how to present an informational speech or how to make a persuasive speech, Tony. And what I've discovered with those students, and I'm talking post-COVID, like the last 3 or 4 years, right, is that their ability to process things deeply just is not there as much because they have been raised with that internet with them all the time. So they can't make inferences as well. They can't draw conclusions as well. You ask them what I would call the classic contention, warrant, impact. Hey, I want to make a statement about something. I have a piece of evidence that's going to support my statement, and here's what it means. Contention, the world's going to be in a horrible place economically if we let Iran control the Strait of Hormuz. Warrant, how much evidence do you need me to show you of that in terms of what it's doing to the price of oil, what we're paying at the pump, and so on and so forth? Impact, if we let it continue, where would that take us? You don't see people being able to string that type of logic together anymore. And that's the scary thing is I'd hate to think that we're going to have a bunch of 20-year-old now and 30-year-old a decade from now automatons walking around that can't think their way out of a paper bag and can't answer a simple question without this device.
Here's a
That's
great
what
litmus. Here's a
that's what
great
I'm
litmus
fearful of.
test. Here's a great litmus test is ask somebody how they would have felt had they not eaten breakfast yesterday. And the average answer you're going to get from people who can't compartmentalize are, but I did eat breakfast yesterday.
Hmm.
And you say, exactly.
Yeah.
Think about that. It's very fascinating where because of that outsourcing of thinking to Google and now to AI services, and is that what we're just going to have to deal with? We're going to deal with a lot of robots. We're going to deal with
Yeah.
automatons who are just living, breathing, eating, defecating creatures that.
Right. And then there's this funny thing here on my end, right? I see people that are grabbing on the Wordle and other things, using computer and other things to try to like get the brain thinking. You keep the brain going, keeping the brain going in a good way. So there's good with it, but the problem is that most of it is just what you said. It's more of an automaton, and I hate to think of that Apple commercial with 1984, but that's kind of where I'm fearful that some of our society's going.
Yeah. Well, I think we're past 1984. I think we're in Huxley Brave New World territory, or even Animal Farm. Last thing, I want to talk about this piece. You had teased it a couple of years ago, and I wanted to get you back on talking about Jesse Owens.
Oh
And
my.
so, talk a little bit about his impact here in Ohio, and just the stories that we've heard, maybe some fact and fiction about it, and just a little bit about who he was as a person.
Yeah. Jesse Owens became larger than life for a lot of reasons, but here's the reality. His parents, Henry and Emma Owens, moved to Cleveland in 1922 as part of what we now call the Great Migration, where lots of blacks moved from the South to the North, moved from sharecropper status and nothing to opportunities in places like Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Indianapolis, Chicago, and so on and so forth. Um, Owens was one of those millions. He ran to a junior high that no longer exists, Fairmont, where a teacher found his God-given gift to be a runner and worked and trained him and got him to the point where by the time he was like an eighth grader, he was considered the best in the country. He goes on to East Tech High School, takes them to a couple of state championships in track and field, and becomes a top prospect that dozens of colleges were interested in. Ends up at Ohio State. And let's just face it, up until that point in his life, he was just known as a track sensation. Then May 25th, 1935, he's competing in the Big Ten track championships at the University of Michigan, and he moves from sensation status to superstar by setting 4 world records in a period of about 45 minutes. And again, because of the way they structured the finals back then. Never will happen again because coaches don't put people in as many events anymore. And there was never an athlete like Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens ran 26, leaped 26 feet 8 inches. I think it was 26 feet 8 1/4 inch. One try at Ann Arbor and set a world record that lasted for 25 years in that
Wow.
event. That's how unbelievable phenomenal he was generationally
And
speaking.
also long before, because one of the things that bothers me, and you see this on sports radio and times like right around now when there's not as much going on as far as NFL, and they always talk about, well, today's athletes are way better, and Babe Ruth was just some fat guy who drank beer and ate hot dogs. You go, yeah, well, but given what we have now as far as creatine and as far as caffeine and things that are not banned, how good would Jesse Owens be today? He'd been the best ever, obviously.
You know,
Give him the tools, give him the weight and strength training that are afforded the luxury, even in the days of Butch Reynolds and Carl Lewis and Michael Johnson. I, I mean, come on now.
you mentioned Carl Lewis and Michael Johnson, long-lasting athletes that also had the benefit of, I'll call it professional support, even as amateurs, because of the way the rules changed. Owens was kicked out of amateur competition a month after winning 4 gold medals in Berlin. And it was in part because of racism and some other things. But at any rate, Tony, I don't want to take up all your listeners' time, so let me just kind of cut to the quick here. There's not been an updated biography of Owens in decades. So when I learned that 2022 was the centennial of him coming to Cleveland, and I happened to have met him when I was a young kid, and he was kind of old.
Really?
So
Wow.
personal, yeah, personal thing. I said, you know what, I want to undertake a few things. So as part of the college's speakers bureau, I put together a talk about Jesse Owens, and then that led me to make an inquiry at Kent State Press. Would they be interested in maybe a new biography on him? And the answer came back yes. So in 2023 and in 2024, I put that together and it's 18 chapters, 700 some odd footnotes. I spent a lot of time looking at Cleveland in the 1920s and the 1930s because that was an undercovered part of Owens' life in my mind. And as I did this, I kind of came up with the typology of Owens' track career and beyond. And I call it Jesse Owens, sensation, superstar, survivor, symbol because it's the kind of 4 phases of what his life was like from the time when Charles Riley, that teacher, found him when he was about 12 or 13 years old to his death in 1980 at the age of 67. And the reason why I think it's so important is that it's also part of America's history. I mean, very few people know that the FBI did an 80-page investigation of Jesse Owens in 1955, for example. And it's kind of important in my mind, even today, to understand what was going on back then.
Yeah.
Very, very few people know about the divisiveness that happened in 1968 when he was at Mexico City and he tried to prevent a couple of gold and bronze medal winning Olympians from being kicked out of the Olympic Village. And he failed, but he tried, you know. And I'm talking about Smith and Carlos and the Mexico
Yeah,
City,
with
this,
the glove, yeah.
yeah, the glove and all that, the Black Power salute. Um, Owens is, in my mind, the epitome of all that's good in America, uh, because he overcame a lot of that racism. And then later on, the nation realized that they needed a symbol around the world of what was good. And what better person than the guy who was black who won four gold medals in Adolf Hitler's backyard, the guy who considered blacks to be subhumans.
I
And
was gonna
and
ask you
that's
that about him with the Austrian painter, that he, there's all these stories of, yeah, how he did viewed that race of people, and yeah, there he is with Hitler. It's like,
yeah.
wow. I mean, for what a degree of separation. You met Jesse Owens, who met Hitler.
I
That's
didn't mean, I did, Tony, I didn't mean to throw you off your game there. I was 15 years old and he came and spoke at my high school.
okay.
That's all it was. And I was smart enough to pull out one of those three-ring notebook pieces of paper and give it to him, and he signed it. Best of luck, Jesse Owens. You know,
We just
um,
had Flip Saunders, who went to my high school, and that's all we met when we were in my high school. So,
there
and
you
Flip
go.
Saunders,
Same,
good guy, but not to the
not
level of
Jesse
Jesse
Owens.
Owens.
Yeah. Well, I discovered later that he was in Cleveland because he gave the speech at the dedication of a brand new high school that day called East Technical High School. That was what brought him to Cleveland that day.
Wow.
He also had an oak tree at my high school, and that's a whole another story. But that he had planted again a year after the Olympics. But the key thing about that whole thing with Owens and Hitler was Owens was the quintessential get along to go along to get along type of guy. He never said anything bad about anybody. He didn't say anything bad about Hitler in 1936, 1937. He was quoted, and it's an accurate quote, one point saying that it wasn't really Adolf Hitler that snubbed me. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because
Yes.
Roosevelt was president of the United States, and Roosevelt didn't invite Owens or any of the Olympians from the 1936 team to come to the White House. And
Is that because he was in a wheelchair by then? He felt,
I discovered research that shown that there were multiple people who had sent letters and made inquiries to the White House suggesting that the Roosevelt do just that, and he turned it down.
wow.
Um,
Well,
so Owens was snubbed, but then again, Hitler snubbed all the blacks. He did congratulate different people who won gold medals. One of the people he congratulated in person was Helen Stephens, who was the woman who won the 100-meter race, an American. He made sure he met her and talked to her after her victory, but he wouldn't talk to Owens. And I discovered it was an intentional snub because he did seek out and talk to Lutz Long, who won the silver medal in the long jump, of course, a German.
hmm.
And boy, did Long upset some Nazis, because when Owens did the last jump and won the gold medal in the long jump, the first person to greet him and greeted him by running into the long jump pit, Tony, and hugging him was Lutz Long, the German.
Wow.
And then those two, arm in arm, went halfway around the track together at Olympic Stadium. Then they both lay down in the grass together and had all kinds of pictures taken of the two of them together. So let's just say that that kind of shattered all of Hitler's aspirations of Aryan supremacy that particular day.
That's so where can we find more information on that?
If you're interested, Ion Cleveland, it's my blog site, EYEON Cleveland.com. If you scroll through there, you'll find some stories that I've written about Owens in the past few years. You pulled up the one that Cleveland.com ran last year about the 90th anniversary of those greatest 45 minutes in sports. And by the way, that's not what I call it. Sports Illustrated actually gave it that name, greatest 45 minutes in sports, because of what happened. But if you just see the very first thing there, where you see Gerald Ford, yeah, that one right there. Um, Almost 40 years after that day, one of the spectators at the University of Michigan that day, by the way, happened to be a student at the University of Michigan named Gerald Ford. So when he's president of the United States, Ford surprises Owens, brings him to the Rose Garden at the White House, ostensibly for a celebration of the 1976 Olympic team, and the 76 Olympians were there, but Jesse Owens was invited, and Ford gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom that day.
Wow.
So, yeah, great story. So my contact information's in there. You can see some other things also. But again, if you just scroll through there, you'll see several stories that I've written over the years about Owens and the snub. Owens Olympians in the White House, because beginning with John F. Kennedy, we saw a pattern where presidents did invite Olympic gold medal winners to the White House and Olympians to the White House. And they did it for a variety of very good reasons. And to the point where by the time we get to 1980, the entire Olympic hockey team gets invited, so
Well, good for
miracle
Gerald
on
Ford.
ice.
It's the only thing I can really say positive about Ford since he was on the Warren Commission and I've been yeah, but anyways, but John, hey, this was a wonderful conversation. I thank you for checking or being on the Check Your Brain podcast. Again, go to Eye on Cleveland for all things John Kersey. And yeah, once again, it's great talking to you. And maybe when we do this again, you'll be retired by then probably, and maybe we can definitely sound off about what has changed in since this podcast will be released.
And at some point, you're going to give me some comedy lessons, Tony.
Yeah, I don't know. I think everyone else can probably to do a better job of giving comedy lessons. I don't.
Nope,
I'm
nope, nope.
I'm just a lowly podcaster here in my Parma, Ohio home. So, but yeah, thank you so much once again, John.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great time.
And thank you, folks, for listening to the Check Your Brain podcast and watching it. Yes, I do have video content available on Rumble and YouTube and X and everything like that, and Spotify and Apple Podcasts and wherever. I think we call them podcatchers nowadays. And again, I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/Tony Mazur. If you want to hear me sound off about anything and everything going on in the world, go check me out there. Thank you for checking out the Check Your Brain podcast. I'll be back with you next Wednesday for another episode of the podcast. Bye now.